Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a problem that has annoyed humanity for thousands of years. Water refuses to go uphill. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy watching ancient people solve problems in ways that make modern life feel slightly unnecessary. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always interesting to see who else is awake, questioning gravity at this hour. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's story together. Water flows downhill. That's the rule. It's simple, dependable, and has never once woken up feeling rebellious. Gravity pulls, water obeys, and the universe continues to function without filing a complaint. Now imagine you're standing in a Roman city nearly 2,000 years ago. The streets are busy. The air smells faintly of bread, animals, and questionable decisions, and somewhere nearby a fountain is running, not struggling, not dripping, confidently sending water upward before letting it fall back down like it owns the place. And here's where things get mildly unsettling. There is no obvious source above you, no mountain looming in the background, no helpful sign saying, "Water originates here, please don't question it." Just water, rising, calmly, casually, as if gravity has decided to take a short break and rethink its career choices. At this point, you have two options. Option 1. Accept it and move on with your day, because you have olives to buy and existential questions are exhausting. Option 2. Stare at the fountain long enough to realize something is deeply suspicious about the entire situation. Because water doesn't do this. It has never done this. It will never do this. And yet, here it is, doing exactly that. Now, before we start crediting the Romans with supernatural abilities, which, to be fair, they probably would have accepted without modesty, it's worth remembering one thing. They weren't magicians. They were engineers, slightly obsessive, highly practical, and absolutely unwilling to accept that's not possible as a final answer. The Romans didn't try to break the rules of nature. That would have been messy. And they preferred their messes to be contained within amphitheatres. Instead, they studied those rules with uncomfortable intensity. They measured, adjusted, argued, remeasured, and probably blamed each other repeatedly until something worked. And what they discovered was not how to make water flow uphill, but how to make it look like it does, which is arguably more impressive and definitely more Roman, because the water you see rising in that fountain has already travelled a long, carefully controlled journey from somewhere far away, usually higher ground that you cannot see from where you're standing. It has been guided across miles, lowered, redirected, pressurized, and politely encouraged to behave in very specific ways. By the time it reaches the fountain, it hasn't defied gravity at all. It has simply followed it, with the kind of precision that suggests someone somewhere lost a lot of sleep making sure it would. And that's the trick. Not breaking the rules, just understanding them so well that everyone else assumes you did. So, after all that quiet suspense, here's the disappointing truth. The Romans did not make water flow uphill. There, mystery ruined, illusion shattered. Somewhere, a Roman engineer just sighed in relief because we finally understood. But before you close the case and go back to your olives, the real story is far more interesting than the myth. Because while the water doesn't actually go uphill, the Romans made it look like it does so convincingly that people are still asking the question 2,000 years later. And honestly, that's a level of confidence we should all aspire to. What the Romans understood, deeply, obsessively, almost uncomfortably, is that water doesn't need to break the rules. It just needs the right path. You see, water is incredibly predictable. It doesn't improvise. It doesn't get creative. It simply follows the easiest route downward, every single time, like a very determined employee who refuses to think outside the job description. The Roman solution, then, was not to fight gravity, but to design a path so carefully that gravity would do exactly what they wanted. Imagine a journey that begins far away, in hills or mountains that sit higher than the city itself. From there, water begins its descent, slowly, steadily, almost lazily, guided through channels that are barely sloped. We're talking about gradients so small that if you blink, you'd miss them. And yet, over long distances, that tiny slope is enough. The water keeps moving. It keeps descending. It keeps obeying the rules, just very, very patiently. Now here's where things start to feel suspicious again, because once that water reaches the city, it can be redirected, channeled, and even pushed into places that appear higher than where it started, at least from your point of view standing in the street. But that's the illusion. The key detail, the one the Romans quietly relied on, is this. The water source is always higher than the final destination. Always. No exceptions. No clever loopholes. Gravity remains undefeated. What changes is perspective. To you, standing in the city, the fountain looks elevated. It looks like the water climbed to get there. But in reality, that water has been falling the entire time, just along a path so long and carefully designed that you can't see the beginning of it. So no, the Romans didn't make water go uphill. They simply made sure you'd never notice that it wasn't. If Roman engineering had a personality, it would be patient, slightly obsessive, and deeply offended by the idea of rushing anything. Because the real secret behind their water systems wasn't force or speed or dramatic innovation. It was patience. The kind of patience that says, we will move this water 10 miles, very slowly, and we will be correct the entire time. This is where aqueducts enter the story, not just those elegant stone bridges you've seen in photos, although yes, they do look like they were built specifically to impress tourists 2,000 years in the future, but the entire system behind them. Long channels, often hidden underground, stretching across landscapes with one simple goal. Keep the water moving, gently, consistently, and without doing anything dramatic. Because dramatic water is dangerous water. The key to an aqueduct wasn't height. It was slope, and not an obvious slope either. Roman engineers worked with gradients so subtle that to the naked eye they looked completely flat. We're talking about a drop of just a few centimetres over long distances, which sounds insignificant, until you realise that over miles, that tiny decline is enough to keep water flowing indefinitely. Too steep, and the water would rush, erode the channel, and destroy the entire system. Basically, the ancient equivalent of turning your shower into a pressure washer. Too flat and the water would stop, completely. No movement, no flow. Just a long, expensive line of disappointment stretching across the countryside. So the Romans aimed for something in between, a perfect, almost invisible descent. And achieving that without modern tools is where things get quietly impressive. No lasers, no digital measurements, just surveying instruments, careful observation, and probably a lot of arguments that ended with someone saying, "It's fine, just shave off a little more stone." These aqueducts could run for dozens of miles, maintaining that delicate slope the entire way. They crossed hills, curved around obstacles, disappeared underground, and occasionally rose into those iconic arches when the terrain demanded it. But through all of it, one rule never changed. The water must always be moving downhill. Always. Which means that by the time it reached the city, even if it appeared to rise into fountains or baths, it had already been descending for its entire journey. Slowly, quietly, and with the kind of consistency that makes modern infrastructure look a little uncertain. So no tricks, no shortcuts, just an empire willing to move water the long way around and somehow make it look effortless. By now, you might be starting to feel slightly suspicious of everything. Good. That's exactly where Roman engineering wants you. Because this is the chapter where things begin to look impossible again. Not because they are, but because your brain insists they should be. Imagine standing in a Roman city, watching water spill into a fountain that sits clearly higher than the surrounding streets, maybe even higher than where you think the water came from. There's no visible mountain looming overhead, no obvious downhill path leading into it, just water rising, performing its quiet little act, as if gravity has decided to loosen its standards. And once again, it hasn't. The trick here is perspective, or more specifically, your lack of it. What you see is the end of the journey. What you don't see is everything that came before it, because somewhere far beyond the city, sometimes miles away, sometimes hidden behind hills or terrain you'd never think to question, there is a source sitting higher than everything you're looking at. That's where the journey begins. That's where gravity quietly signs the contract and agrees to do all the work. From there, the water travels along aqueducts, descending ever so slightly. Not dramatically, not noticeably, just enough to keep moving. It curves, it bends, it disappears underground, It reappears when necessary, and all the while it continues its slow, obedient fall. Now here's where the illusion sharpens. As the water approaches the city, engineers can guide it into structures that sit at different elevations, some slightly higher than others. To you, standing nearby, it looks like the water has climbed to reach them, but it hasn't climbed anything. It has simply arrived at a point that is still lower than where it started, even if it doesn't feel that way from your limited viewpoint. It's a bit like watching someone walk down a mountain, disappear behind a hill, and then reappear on what looks like higher ground. You assume they went up. In reality, they never stopped going down. You just lost sight of the full path. And that's the entire trick. The Romans didn't change how water behaves. They changed how you see it behave. They relied on distance, terrain, and your inability to visualize a journey that stretches far beyond what your eyes can confirm. So when you stand in that city, watching water rise into a fountain, it feels like something impossible is happening. But in truth, gravity is still quietly in control. It's just working from somewhere you can't see. Up to this point, the Roman strategy has been calm, patient, and almost meditative. Gentle slopes, long distances, quiet obedience to gravity. And then, inevitably, they encounter a problem. A valley. Not a polite dip in the landscape, but a deep, inconvenient drop that essentially says, you can go around me, or you can spend the next 3 years building something dramatic. Now, Rome did enjoy building dramatic things, but sometimes even they looked at a massive valley and thought, there has to be a less theatrical option. Enter the inverted siphon, a solution that sounds complicated, looks suspicious, and works beautifully when you understand what's happening. Here's the idea. Instead of guiding water slowly across a bridge or around the valley, the Romans would send it straight down one side and then back up the other, which, at first glance, sounds like exactly the thing we said water cannot do. Stay with me. The trick lies in pressure. When water flows downhill, it doesn't just move, it gains force. The deeper it goes, the more pressure builds up inside a closed pipe. It's like gravity quietly leaning in and saying, let me help with that. Now, once the water reaches the bottom of the valley, all that built-up pressure has nowhere to go except forward. And if the pipe continues upward on the other side, that pressure will push the water back up. Not higher than where it started. Gravity still refuses to be embarrassed, but high enough to climb the opposite slope and continue its journey. So, from the outside, it looks like the water went down, changed its mind, and then decided to go up anyway. In reality, it never stopped obeying the rules. It just used them more aggressively. Of course, this only works if the system is completely sealed. One leak, one weak joint, and suddenly your carefully engineered siphon becomes a very expensive fountain in the wrong place. Which means Roman engineers had to be precise. Very precise. The kind of precise that probably involved a lot of staring, measuring, and quietly blaming the last person who touched the pipe. But when it worked, and it often did, it allowed water to cross terrain that would otherwise require enormous structures, no towering arches, no scenic detours, just a hidden system, quietly pushing water where it needed to go. And once again, from the outside, it looked like something impossible had just happened, which at this point was becoming a bit of a Roman habit. By now, the Roman plan sounds elegant. Almost too elegant. Send water downhill, build pressure, push it back up, and casually pretend this was always a reasonable thing to attempt. There's just one small problem. Pipes. Because all of this cleverness, the siphons, the pressure, the carefully controlled flow, depends entirely on whether your pipes can survive the experience. And water under pressure is not gentle. It doesn't politely ask permission. It pushes, it strains, and given the slightest weakness, it will escape with enthusiasm and absolutely no regard for your engineering reputation. So the Romans had to build pipes that were not only functional but stubborn. They used materials like stone, terracotta, and most famously, lead. Yes, that lead. The same one that modern people try very hard not to drink from. But in the Roman world, it had a few advantages. It was flexible, relatively easy to shape, and strong enough to handle internal pressure when used correctly. Which brings us to the part where things get slightly stressful, because calculating how thick those pipes needed to be wasn't optional. Too thin, and the pressure inside a siphon could split them open like overconfident bread dough. Too thick, and you're wasting material, time, and money, three things even Rome preferred not to throw away casually, so engineers had to find the balance, not through advanced simulations or helpful software, but through experience, observation, and the occasional failure that probably made a very loud noise. And when these pipes were laid into the system, especially in inverted siphons, they had to be sealed with remarkable precision. Joints needed to hold, connections needed to align, because even a small leak wouldn't just drip. It would spray, lose pressure, and quietly ruin the entire illusion. Imagine building a system designed to make water appear to climb, only for it to burst halfway through and flood a field instead. Not ideal. And yet, despite all of this, many of these systems worked. Not for days or months, but for years, sometimes decades. Which means that somewhere in the Roman world, engineers were watching pressurized water rush through pipes they built by hand, nodding slightly and thinking, yes, this should not work, but it does. And that's the thing about Roman engineering. It wasn't just clever in theory, it held together in reality, under pressure, under stress, and under the constant threat of water reminding everyone who was really in charge. By the time water reached the city, it had already completed an impressively long and obedient journey. It had flowed downhill for miles, survived slopes that required monk-like patience, endured pressure systems that could have easily gone wrong, and somehow arrived intact. At this point, you might think the Romans would simply let it flow freely and call it a day. They did not, because if there's one thing Rome disliked more than inefficiency, it was uncontrolled anything, especially something as valuable as water. So instead, the water was brought into a structure known as a castellum, essentially a distribution tank. Though calling it that feels a bit like calling the Colosseum a seating arrangement. This was where the system slowed down, settled, and became organised. Water entered the castellum with force, especially if it had just come through a siphon. Left unchecked, that pressure could damage pipes, flood areas, or generally behave in ways that would make engineers very uncomfortable. So the castellum acted as a kind of calming station. Think of it as the moment when a very energetic guest arrives at a formal dinner and is politely asked to sit down and lower their voice. Inside the tank, water would spread out, lose some of its pressure, and then be divided into multiple channels. Each channel led somewhere specific: public fountains, bathhouses, private homes, sometimes even ornamental displays designed to remind everyone that Rome had water to spare. And this distribution wasn't random, it was prioritized. Public needs came first. Fountains and baths were essential to Roman life, not just for hygiene, but for social structure, politics, and the general appearance of a functioning civilization. After that came private connections, often reserved for wealthier citizens who could afford the luxury of having water delivered directly to their homes. So while the water system looked smooth and effortless from the outside, underneath it was carefully controlled, measured, and rationed. Because without that control, the entire illusion would collapse. Too much pressure, and pipes burst. Too little, and the fountains fall silent. Which, in a Roman city, is less a minor inconvenience and more a public embarrassment. And Rome, as we've established, did not enjoy being embarrassed. So the castellum stood quietly at the heart of the system, doing something far less glamorous than making water flow uphill, but far more important, making sure everything worked exactly as it should. Because in the end, the real genius of Rome wasn't just moving water, it was controlling it. At this point, you might be wondering something very reasonable. If the Romans were so good at building those towering aqueduct bridges, the kind that still stand today looking mildly superior to modern construction, why didn't they just build them everywhere? Why bother with pipes, pressure, and systems that sound like they require constant supervision and occasional emotional support? The short answer: because even Rome had limits. The long answer is far more interesting. Building an aqueduct bridge across a valley was not a casual weekend project. It required enormous amounts of stone, labour, time, and organisation. Entire teams of workers had to quarry materials, transport them, shape them, and assemble structures that could stretch for hundreds of metres. All of this just to maintain a gentle slope for water that refuses to be rushed. And while Rome had the resources, it also had something even more important: practicality. Sometimes A valley was simply too wide, too deep, or too inconvenient to justify building a massive bridge. Not because it couldn't be done, but because it would take years, cost a fortune, and probably involve several engineers having long, quiet disagreements about whose fault it was taking so long. So instead of forcing the landscape to cooperate, the Romans adapted. This is where systems like inverted siphons became not just clever but necessary. By using pipes and pressure, they could send water down into a valley and back up the other side without building anything visible at all. No arches, no towering structures, just a hidden solution doing its job quietly beneath the surface. Of course, this approach came with its own challenges. Pipes could fail, pressure could be misjudged, repairs were more difficult because everything was less accessible. In other words, instead of one big visible problem, you now had several smaller invisible ones. But for the Romans, this was often a worthwhile trade, because efficiency mattered, time mattered, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to solve a problem without turning it into a monument was, in its own way, a sign of true engineering confidence. Still, when conditions allowed, they did build the bridges. And when they did, they built them with a kind of quiet arrogance, perfectly aligned, carefully measured, and strong enough to survive centuries of weather, neglect, and modern tourists taking photos from slightly awkward angles. So the choice wasn't between bridges or pipes. It was about using the right solution for the right problem. Sometimes that meant building something grand and visible, and sometimes it meant solving the problem so cleanly that no one even realized there was one to begin with. By now the system sounds impressive. Long distances, gentle slopes, pressure systems, distribution tanks, everything working together with suspicious efficiency. But here's the part that should make you slightly uncomfortable. The Romans did all of this without modern tools. No laser levels, no GPS, no computer models quietly correcting mistakes before they happen. Just basic surveying instruments, careful observation, and a level of patience that would probably make most modern engineers reconsider their career choices. And yet, their aqueducts maintained gradients so precise that even small errors could have ruined everything. Because remember, this entire system depends on balance. Too steep, and the water speeds up, erodes the channel, and eventually damages the structure. Too flat, and the water slows down, then stops. And suddenly you have an aqueduct that looks impressive but functions as a very long decorative trench. So the slope had to be just right, not approximately right, not close enough, exactly right. To achieve this, Roman engineers used tools like the corributes, essentially a long wooden beam with a water level, and the groma, used for alignment. Simple devices, but when used carefully, surprisingly effective. Imagine standing in the heat, trying to measure a nearly invisible slope over miles of terrain, adjusting stone by stone, knowing that a small miscalculation here could mean failure much later, where fixing it would be far more difficult and significantly more embarrassing. Because that's the other thing. Mistakes didn't always reveal themselves immediately. Water might flow perfectly for part of the journey, only to slow down or overflow much farther along, which means the problem could be miles away from where the symptoms appear. So diagnosing issues wasn't just about fixing what you could see. It required understanding the entire system. Every turn, every slope, every joint. And somehow they managed it. Not perfectly, of course. There were failures, miscalculations, adjustments. Probably a fair amount of quiet frustration followed by very determined corrections. But overall, the level of precision they achieved is difficult to ignore, because this wasn't guesswork. It was careful, repeated, disciplined engineering, built on observation, experience, and a refusal to accept that something so subtle as a slight slope could be treated casually. So while modern tools make this kind of work easier, the Romans proved something far more unsettling. They showed that with enough patience and understanding, you don't necessarily need advanced technology to achieve remarkable precision. You just need to be willing to take your time and get it right the first time, or spend a very long time fixing it later. By this point, it's clear the Romans didn't move water just for convenience. They moved it because it gave them something far more valuable than comfort: control. Because in the ancient world, water wasn't just something you drank, it was something you managed, and whoever managed it quietly managed everything else. A Roman city with flowing water wasn't just functional. It was organised, disciplined, and most importantly, impressive. Fountains didn't exist purely for decoration. They were statements, visible proof that somewhere, far beyond the city, an invisible system was working perfectly. Water flowed here because Rome said it would, and that mattered. Public fountains ensured that even the poorest citizens had access to fresh water, which in practical terms meant fewer diseases, cleaner streets, and a population that was just slightly less likely to revolt over basic necessities. Always a helpful outcome. Then there were the baths. Roman baths were not optional luxuries. They were central to daily life, places where people washed, socialised, discussed politics, made deals, and occasionally pretended to relax while judging everyone else's life choices. And all of it depended on a steady, reliable supply of water. Without it, the baths fall silent. Without the baths, the social rhythm of the city starts to collapse. And suddenly, Rome feels less like an empire and more like a very large collection of disappointed people. But perhaps the most revealing use of water was in private homes. Not everyone had direct access. That privilege was often reserved for wealthier citizens who could afford connections to the system. And when they did, it wasn't subtle. Water features, small fountains, decorative basins, all quietly announcing that this household didn't just exist within Rome. It benefited from it. Because water, in this context, wasn't just utility, it was status. And then there was industry. Mills powered by flowing water, workshops relying on steady supply, infrastructure that quietly turned water into productivity. The system wasn't just sustaining life, it was driving it forward. So when we talk about Romans making water flow uphill, we're not just talking about a clever trick of engineering. We're talking about a system that transformed water into influence. Because once you can move water wherever you want, across miles, through cities, into homes, baths and fountains, you're no longer reacting to nature. You're organising it. And that's when water stops being a resource and starts becoming power. By now, the mechanics are clear. Slopes, pressure, pipes, patience, all working together in a system that never actually breaks the rules. And yet, standing in a Roman city, watching water rise into a fountain, none of that is what you feel. What you feel is that something impossible is happening, because human perception is not particularly interested in long explanations. It prefers simple conclusions. Water is going up. Therefore, something unusual is taking place. End of analysis. And the Romans understood this, not as a scientific curiosity, but as a psychological advantage. They didn't just build systems that worked. They built systems that looked like they shouldn't. Imagine arriving in a city where water flows constantly. Clean, controlled, and abundant. It appears in fountains, spills into basins, feeds baths, and disappears again, as if guided by an invisible hand. You don't see the miles of aqueduct behind it. You don't see the careful slope calculations or the hidden pipes. You see the result. And the result feels unnatural. Not in a frightening way, in an impressive way. The kind that makes you pause, look around, and quietly accept that whoever built this city understands the world better than you do. Which for Rome was exactly the point. Because infrastructure isn't just about function, it's about perception. A city that controls water looks powerful, organised, advanced. It suggests stability, intelligence and authority, all without saying a single word. You don't need propaganda when your fountains are doing the work for you. And this effect goes deeper than simple admiration. When people believe a system is almost beyond their understanding, they're less likely to question it, less likely to challenge it. It becomes something to rely on rather than something to doubt. So when water appears to flow uphill, it's not just an engineering success. It's a quiet statement. Rome doesn't just follow the rules of nature. Rome understands them so well that it can make them look optional. Of course, behind the illusion, everything is still grounded in reality. Gravity still pulls. Water still obeys. Engineers still worry about pipes bursting at inconvenient moments. But none of that is visible from the street. All you see is water doing something that feels slightly wrong, and yet perfectly controlled. And in that moment, without realizing it, you've accepted the illusion. Not because it's true, but because it's convincing enough to feel like it is. By now, the Roman water system sounds almost effortless. Water travels for miles, survives slopes, pressure, and engineering ambition, arrives in the city, and performs its duties with quiet elegance. It feels smooth, reliable, permanent. It was none of those things, because behind every flowing fountain and perfectly supplied bath stood something far less glamorous: constant maintenance. Water systems, as it turns out, are not self-aware. They do not fix themselves out of pride. They do not apologize when something breaks. They simply stop working, often at the worst possible moment, and wait for someone else to deal with it. And in Rome, that someone else was an entire workforce dedicated to keeping the illusion alive. Aqueducts had to be inspected regularly. Channels would accumulate sediment over time. Minerals, debris, anything the water decided to carry along for the journey. Left unchecked, this build-up could slow the flow, reduce capacity, or block sections entirely. So workers entered these channels, often in confined, damp spaces, to clean them manually. Not glamorous work, not particularly comfortable work, but absolutely necessary. Then there were the leaks. Stone cracks, joints weaken, pipes shift, and water, being both persistent and deeply uncooperative, takes full advantage of any weakness. A small crack doesn't stay small for long. It widens, pressure drops, and suddenly a system designed for precision becomes less precise, which in Roman terms is unacceptable. So repairs had to be quick and effective. Sections were sealed, replaced, reinforced, sometimes while the system was still in use, because shutting down the water supply of a city was not something you did casually unless you enjoyed widespread complaints. And then there were the siphons. Those clever pressure systems required even more attention. High pressure meant higher risk. A failure there wasn't subtle. It was loud, messy, and very public. Not ideal when your entire reputation is built on things working smoothly. But perhaps the most important part of maintenance was consistency. This wasn't something you fixed once and forgot. It was continuous, daily, seasonal, ongoing. A system that looked timeless from the outside was, in reality, being quietly managed every single day. Because without that effort, everything stops. The fountains go silent. The baths empty. The illusion collapses. And suddenly Rome doesn't look like a master of nature anymore. It looks ordinary, which, more than anything, was what they were trying to avoid. For all their precision, patience, and quiet confidence, the Romans were still dealing with one inconvenient truth. Water has no respect for reputation. It does not care that you are the greatest empire in the known world. It does not pause to admire your aqueducts or politely follow your expectations. It follows physics. And if you miscalculate even slightly, it will remind you, immediately, loudly, and often in public. Because when Roman water systems failed, they didn't fail subtly. A cracked pipe under pressure didn't leak gently. It burst. Water would force its way out with enthusiasm, turning carefully planned systems into chaotic displays of unintended fountains. Not the decorative kind either. The kind that makes nearby workers step back and reconsider their life choices. In aqueduct channels, problems could be slower, but no less frustrating. A slight miscalculation in slope might not stop the water immediately. Instead, it would gradually slow, hesitate, and eventually settle into a stagnant stretch that served no one. Somewhere downstream, fountains would weaken, baths would receive less water, and people would begin to notice. And when people notice something missing, especially something as essential as water, they tend to complain loudly, which meant the problem had to be found. And that, perhaps, was the most difficult part, because the failure rarely occurred where the symptoms appeared. A dry fountain in the city might be caused by a blockage miles away. A pressure drop could trace back to a leak hidden underground, far from where anyone was looking. So engineers and workers had to track the issue through the system, piece by piece, often relying on experience, intuition, and the kind of slow, methodical thinking that doesn't make for dramatic storytelling, but gets results. And then there were the siphons, those brilliant, slightly risky solutions. When a siphon failed, it didn't whisper. It announced itself. Pressure would escape, pipes could rupture, and suddenly your clever shortcut across a valley became a very visible problem that everyone could see and no one could ignore. Not ideal for an empire built on the appearance of control. But here's the important part. The Romans expected failure, not constantly but inevitably. Systems this large, this complex, and this dependent on precision were never going to run perfectly forever. So they built with that in mind. They monitored, repaired, adjusted, and improved. Failure wasn't the end of the system, it was part of it, which is perhaps the most quietly impressive detail of all. They didn't just build something that worked, they built something that could keep working, even after it didn't. At this point, it would be easy to treat all of this as a clever historical curiosity. Ancient people, impressive engineering, very nice arches, and then we move on, slightly impressed and mildly grateful we don't have to maintain it ourselves. But here's the uncomfortable part. We are still using the same ideas, not similar ideas, not inspired by ideas, the same ideas. Gravity moves water, pressure redirects it, pipes contain it, systems distribute it. That's it. That's the entire foundation of modern water infrastructure, just refined, upgraded, and slightly less likely to involve someone chiseling stone in the sun while questioning their life decisions. Every time you turn on a tap, water doesn't appear by magic. It arrives because somewhere a system has been designed to move it from a higher point to a lower one, controlling speed, pressure, and direction along the way. Sound familiar? It should. The Romans didn't invent water, but they did something arguably more important. They turned it into a predictable, manageable system on a massive scale. They proved that you could take something as simple and stubborn as flowing water and guide it across miles, through cities, and into daily life without chaos. And that idea never left us. Modern cities still rely on careful gradients. Reservoirs are placed at higher elevations for the same reason Roman sources were. Pressure is still used to push water where gravity alone isn't enough. Distribution systems still divide flow based on need, priority, and design. The tools have changed. The scale has grown. The calculations are faster, but the logic? Exactly the same, which makes Roman engineering slightly unsettling, because it means that 2,000 years ago, with limited tools and no modern technology, they reached conclusions that we still depend on today, not as a backup plan, but as the foundation. And perhaps more importantly, they understood something we occasionally forget. A system doesn't need to be flashy to be powerful. It just needs to work. Consistently, reliably, and without drawing attention to itself when it does. That's why their aqueducts still stand. Not just as ruins, but as quiet reminders that good engineering doesn't age the way trends do. It doesn't become outdated, it becomes invisible. So when we look back at Roman water systems, we're not just looking at history, we're looking at the early version of something we still use every single day, often without thinking about it at all. So after all the arches, the pipes, the pressure, the careful measurements, and the quiet obsession with getting everything exactly right, we arrive at the truth. The Romans never made water flow uphill. Not once. Gravity remained firmly in charge the entire time, completely unimpressed by Roman ambition. Water still flowed down just as it always had, just as it always will. No exceptions. No dramatic betrayals of physics. No hidden moment where nature decided to take a break and let Rome show off. And yet, standing in those cities, watching fountains rise and water appear where it shouldn't, it felt like something else was happening. Something just slightly beyond explanation. That's the real achievement. Because what the Romans built wasn't just a system that worked. They built a system that looked like it shouldn't. They didn't fight gravity. That would have been impossible, and more importantly, inefficient, which Rome took very personally. Instead, they studied it, respected it, and then used it with such precision that it created the illusion of defiance. Every aqueduct, every siphon, every pipe was part of that illusion. A carefully constructed narrative where water seemed to rise, to appear, to behave in ways that suggested control over nature itself. But behind that illusion was something far more impressive than magic. Understanding, the Romans knew exactly what water would do, how it would behave, how it would respond under pressure, across distance, through different materials. They didn't guess. They observed, tested, adjusted, and built systems that worked not because they were extraordinary, but because they were correct. And that's the part that tends to get overlooked, because it's easy to admire the arches, the scale, the visible achievements. It's harder to appreciate the invisible precision behind them. The slight slopes, the sealed joints, the careful control of pressure, the details that no one sees but everything depends on. So no, they didn't break the rules. They mastered them. And in doing so, they created something that still impresses us today. Not because it was impossible, but because it was done so well that it felt impossible, which in a way is far more difficult, because anyone can claim to defy nature. Very few can understand it so completely that they make it look like they did, and that is the quiet genius of Rome. Florence, late 15th century. A city bursting with bankers, painters, poets, and one stubborn boy who already looked slightly annoyed with all of them. Michelangelo Buonarroti was not born into greatness, at least not the kind his father had planned. His family, the Buonarroti, clung tightly to the idea that they were respectable, minor nobility. Respectable people, naturally, did not spend their days covered in dust, hammering rocks like enthusiastic labourers. Unfortunately for them, Michelangelo had already decided that rocks were far more interesting than people. As a child, he was sent to live with a stonecutter's family, a practical arrangement meant to keep him out of trouble. Instead, it did the opposite. While other boys absorbed manners, Michelangelo absorbed marble dust, quite literally. Years later, he would claim that his love for sculpture came from the milk of his wet nurse, who happened to be the wife of a stonecutter. Subtle. Back in Florence, the city itself became his classroom. Churches filled with frescoes, statues standing in quiet defiance of time. These were not decorations to him. They were challenges, silent ones, the kind that say, "You think you can do better?" Michelangelo, being Michelangelo, silently answered, yes. His father, Lodovico Buonarroti, was less impressed. Art was not a career. It was a hobby for those who had already made money doing something respectable. When young Michelangelo insisted on pursuing it, arguments followed, then punishments, then more arguments, because Michelangelo had the charming habit of not backing down. Eventually, resistance collapsed, not out of agreement, but exhaustion. Michelangelo was sent to apprentice in the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, a painter's studio. A sensible compromise if you believed Michelangelo would become a painter. He would not. Even there, surrounded by pigments and brushes, he drifted toward sculpture, toward form, toward something solid and eternal. Painting, to him, was suspiciously temporary. It didn't take long for others to notice that this boy wasn't merely talented. He was intense, quiet, observant, and already carrying the air of someone mildly inconvenienced by the limitations of the world around him. And Florence, a city that thrived on talent and ego in equal measure, had just gained a new problem. Because Michelangelo wasn't trying to fit in, he was preparing to outgrow everyone. Florence had a habit of collecting talent the way kings collect taxes, aggressively and with high expectations. And somewhere in that elegant machinery of ambition stood a teenage Michelangelo Buonarroti, already developing the dangerous confidence of someone who suspects he might be better than everyone else. His apprenticeship under Domenico Ghirlandaio didn't last long, not because Michelangelo failed, but because he was quickly noticed by someone far more powerful. Lorenzo de' Medici, also known as the Magnificent, which, to be fair, is a title that leaves little room for humility. Lorenzo ran something extraordinary, a sculpture garden filled with classical statues, ancient fragments, and young artists competing quietly with ghosts of Greece and Rome. It wasn't just a training ground, it was a stage, and Michelangelo walked onto it like he had been waiting his entire life. Here, surrounded by ancient forms, he found what he had been looking for. Perfection carved in stone, not painted illusions, not fleeting colours, real bodies, real weight, real presence. Marble that seemed to breathe if you stared long enough. Naturally, Michelangelo took this as a personal challenge. Under the guidance of Bertoldo di Giovanni, a student of Donatello, Michelangelo refined his craft. But refinement is a polite word. What he really did was absorb everything at an alarming speed, and then quietly start surpassing expectations. And then came the incident. Another student, Pietro Torrigiano, took issue with Michelangelo's attitude, which admittedly could be described as subtly unbearable. Words were exchanged, pride was wounded, and then, in a moment that would permanently alter Michelangelo's face, Torrigiano punched him, hard. Michelangelo's nose was broken, flattened for life. A Renaissance souvenir, if you will. Torrigiano would later boast about it, as if punching a genius in the face was a career highlight. Michelangelo, on the other hand, carried the mark quietly. A visible reminder that talent, in Florence, did not protect you from consequences. Yet if anything, it hardened him. Life in Lorenzo's circle wasn't just about art. It was philosophy, poetry, politics, an entire world of ideas. Michelangelo sat among scholars, listening, absorbing, occasionally judging. He wasn't just learning how to carve bodies. He was learning how to think like someone destined to leave a mark on history. Then, in 1492, Lorenzo died. And just like that, the garden lost its patron, Florence lost its balance, and Michelangelo lost the protection that had allowed his talent to grow. The world outside was less forgiving, and far less patient. When Lorenzo de' Medici died, Florence did not gently transition into a new chapter. It unravelled, loudly, dramatically, and with the kind of moral panic that only history can deliver with such confidence. Into that vacuum stepped Girolamo Savonarola, a man who looked at Renaissance Florence, with its art, luxury, and suspiciously cheerful nudity, and decided it was all a terrible mistake. His sermons were not subtle. They were fire, brimstone, and the general suggestion that God was deeply disappointed. Florence listened. Soon, the city that had celebrated beauty began to fear it. Paintings were questioned. Sculptures were tolerated with increasing discomfort. And then came the infamous bonfire of the vanities, a cheerful gathering where books, artworks, cosmetics, and anything remotely indulgent were thrown into flames, as if burning objects might solve existential problems. Michelangelo watched this shift with a kind of quiet unease. This was not the Florence he had thrived in. The city that once challenged artists now threatened to erase them. Inspiration was being replaced with suspicion. Not ideal conditions for a man who already struggled with authority on a good day. So, like many sensible people faced with chaos, he left. He travelled first to Bologna, a city that offered stability, and more importantly, work. There he was commissioned to carve small statues for the shrine of Saint Dominic. It wasn't grand, it wasn't revolutionary, but it was precise, disciplined work, the kind that quietly sharpens a craftsman's edge, and Michelangelo sharpened. He studied anatomy more intensely, observed bodies, muscles, tension beneath skin. Where others saw figures, he saw structure, movement trapped inside stillness. Even in these smaller commissions, something was building, something that would not stay small for long. Eventually, Florence called him back, not because it had stabilised. It hadn't. But because home has a way of pulling even the most stubborn exile. He returned to a city still wrestling with its identity. The echoes of Savonarola lingered, though his influence would soon collapse. Florence was changing again, as it always did, and Michelangelo returned changed as well. No longer just a promising student in a garden of statues. Now he was something more dangerous. A young artist who had seen instability, survived it, and was ready to prove exactly what he could do with a block of stone and a very long memory. Florence had sharpened him. Exile had hardened him. But Rome... Rome was where Michelangelo Buonarroti began to quietly terrify his competition. He arrived in the city in the late 1500s, young, ambitious, and already carrying the kind of confidence that suggested he was either destined for greatness or about to offend someone important. In Renaissance Italy, these were often the same thing. Rome was different from Florence. Less philosophical debate, more ancient ghosts. Everywhere you looked, the ruins of the Roman Empire stood like silent judges, reminding every artist that greatness had already been achieved. Good luck trying to match it. Naturally, Michelangelo took this personally. His first major Roman commission came through Cardinal Raffaele Riario. It did not go smoothly. Michelangelo produced a sculpture of Bacchus, the god of wine, slightly off balance, almost drunk, and very much not the noble, controlled figure people expected. It was too real, too human, the kind of realism that makes patrons uncomfortable because it suggests flaws. The cardinal rejected it. For most artists, this would have been a setback. For Michelangelo, it was more of a warning shot to Rome. He wasn't interested in polite expectations. Then came the commission that changed everything. A French cardinal, Jean de Villers-Lagrola, wanted something extraordinary for his tomb in St. Peter's Basilica, a sculpture of the Virgin Mary holding the dead body of Christ, a subject already explored many times. Michelangelo, of course, decided to do it better. The result was the Pietà, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just impossibly calm. Mary, young and serene, holding Christ's lifeless body with a quiet acceptance that felt almost unsettling. The marble looked soft. The skin seemed real. The folds of fabric fell with impossible precision. It didn't look carved. It looked revealed, Rome noticed. Visitors gathered, stared, whispered. Some doubted it had been made by a young artist. Rumours spread that someone else must have done it. Michelangelo, not usually concerned with public opinion, made a rare exception. One night he returned to the sculpture and carved his name across Mary's sash. The only work he would ever sign. Subtlety was not the goal. With the Pietà, Michelangelo had done more than prove himself. He had redefined what sculpture could be. Not just form, not just anatomy, but emotion, captured in stone so precisely it felt almost inappropriate to breathe near it. Rome, once sceptical, now paid attention, and Michelangelo, having tasted recognition, was not about to stop. Because back in Florence, a massive block of abandoned marble was waiting, and it had already defeated 2 artists, which to Michelangelo sounded less like a warning and more like an invitation. Florence had a habit of keeping unfinished business, sometimes in the form of politics, sometimes in the form of a very large, very neglected block of marble. The block had been sitting there for decades, massive, weathered, and quietly embarrassing. 2 artists had already tried to carve it and failed, leaving behind a damaged, awkward slab that most people considered unusable. It earned a nickname, Il Gigante, the giant, not out of respect, but out of mild frustration. Naturally, this is where Michelangelo Buonarroti stepped in. At just 26, he was offered the challenge. Many saw it as a risk. Michelangelo saw it as an opportunity to prove something very specific, that limitations were suggestions, not rules. The marble itself was flawed, narrow, already cut into, and structurally unpredictable. A safer artist would have chosen a different block. Michelangelo chose war. He began work in 1501, setting up a private enclosure around the stone, not out of modesty but control. He worked obsessively, often alone, chipping away with the kind of focus that suggested he wasn't creating a figure. He was uncovering it, because in his mind the figure was already there. The subject he chose was David, not as a victorious hero, but in the moment before battle, calm, alert, calculating. A young man facing something much larger than himself, fully aware of the risk, and entirely unbothered by it. It was in many ways a self-portrait. As the statue began to take shape, rumours spread. People whispered about the size, the precision, the audacity of it. Florence, always eager for spectacle, began to pay attention again. And then, in 1504, the work was revealed. David stood over 5 meters tall, muscles tense, veins visible, expression focused. Not triumphant, but thinking. Alive in a way that made viewers slightly uncomfortable, as if the statue might step down at any moment and ask why they were staring. The city was stunned. Where to place it became a political decision. This wasn't just art, it was a symbol. Florence, small but defiant, facing larger powers. Sound familiar? Eventually, David was placed outside the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of government. A statement carved in marble. We may be small, but we are not weak. Michelangelo had done what others couldn't. He had taken a ruined block and turned it into something almost perfect. But success in Florence came with a cost. Because when you create something that impressive, people start expecting the impossible. And soon, someone in Rome had a request. A ceiling. A very large one. And Michelangelo, who had spent his entire life insisting he wasn't a painter, was about to run out of excuses. Success, unfortunately, attracts attention. And in Renaissance Italy, attention often came in the form of powerful men with very specific requests and very little patience. Enter Pope Julius II. A man known for military campaigns, grand ambitions, and the subtle charm of a cannon aimed at your career. He had already commissioned Michelangelo Buonarroti to design his tomb, a massive, complex project filled with sculptures. Michelangelo naturally was thrilled. Finally, marble, scale, purpose. Then the project stalled. Funds were redirected. Priorities shifted. Rome, as always, found new ways to complicate things. Michelangelo, not known for his patience, grew irritated. Julius, not known for compromise, grew equally irritated. What followed was a disagreement, a loud one. Michelangelo left Rome. Julius demanded he return. There were letters, threats, and the general sense that neither man intended to lose. Eventually, Michelangelo came back. This is where things take a turn. Instead of resuming the tomb, Julius gave him a new assignment: paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo's reaction was immediate and entirely reasonable. No, he insisted he was a sculptor. Painting was not his craft. Fresco work, especially on that scale, required techniques he had never fully mastered. This wasn't modesty, it was accuracy. He suspected, not without reason, that rivals like Raphael had influenced the decision, hoping to see him fail spectacularly. Julius did not care. Refusal was not an option. So Michelangelo accepted, reluctantly, defiantly, and probably already planning to complain about it for the next 4 years. The original plan was simple: paint a few apostles, manageable, respectable, forgettable. Michelangelo rejected it. If he was going to suffer, he would at least suffer on a grand scale. He redesigned the entire project, expanding it into a vast visual narrative of creation, humanity, and divine judgment. Figures twisting, reaching, straining across the ceiling. Not decorative, not passive, alive. Then came the practical problem. Painting a ceiling is exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds. Contrary to popular myth, Michelangelo did not lie on his back. He stood on scaffolding, head tilted upward for hours, paint dripping, neck aching, eyesight straining. He wrote poems about it, complaints disguised as art. Work began in 1508. It would consume him, physically, mentally, and creatively. Because Michelangelo had agreed to paint a ceiling, what he was actually about to do was redefine what painting could be. If you ever feel inconvenienced at work, consider the situation of Michelangelo Buonarroti between 1508 and 1512, standing on scaffolding, neck bent at unnatural angles, paint dripping onto his face, all while insisting, repeatedly, that he was not a painter. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel was not a project. It was an endurance test disguised as art. Michelangelo began with assistants, sensible, efficient, completely incompatible with his personality. He dismissed most of them early on, dissatisfied with their work. Control for him was not optional. It was essential. If something was going to bear his name, it would be done his way, even if that meant doing most of it alone. The technique itself didn't make things easier. Fresco painting requires applying pigment onto wet plaster. Timing had to be precise. Work too slowly and the plaster dries. Work too quickly and mistakes become permanent. There's no gentle correction, no quiet adjustments, just commitment and consequences. Michelangelo naturally chose commitment. He divided the ceiling into sections, tackling them piece by piece. At first the figures were smaller, more crowded. Then something shifted. Confidence, or perhaps impatience, took over. The figures grew larger, more dynamic, more ambitious. Bodies twisted with impossible tension. Muscles carried weight and meaning. Even in paint, Michelangelo was thinking like a sculptor. And then there was the centerpiece, the creation. In the famous panel where God reaches out toward Adam, fingers nearly touching, Michelangelo captured something unsettlingly human. Not just divine power, but anticipation. A moment suspended between nothing and everything. People would later call it genius. At the time, it was just another day of exhaustion. His body suffered. His eyesight blurred. He wrote about it in a poem, describing his beard pointing toward heaven, his back bent like a bow, paint constantly falling into his eyes. It reads less like artistic reflection and more like a very educated complaint letter. Meanwhile, Pope Julius II grew impatient. He demanded progress, results, completion. Michelangelo, already stretched thin, responded with the calm professionalism one might expect, which is to say, not very calmly. They argued, frequently, but Michelangelo kept working. 4 years passed. Layer by layer, figure by figure, the ceiling transformed from an obligation into something else entirely. Not decoration, not compliance, a statement. Because when Michelangelo finally stepped down from that scaffolding, exhausted and half-blinded by effort. He hadn't just painted a ceiling, he had turned it into a universe, and Rome would never look up the same way again. When the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel was finally unveiled in 1512, Rome did what Rome does best when confronted with greatness. It stared, whispered, and then quietly adjusted its expectations of what art was supposed to be. Michelangelo Buonarroti, exhausted and irritated, had achieved something inconveniently undeniable. The man who insisted he wasn't a painter had just outperformed most painters alive, a deeply annoying outcome for his rivals. Among those rivals was Raphael, already celebrated, already admired, and now quietly studying Michelangelo's work with the focus of someone who understood that the bar had just been raised to an uncomfortable height. Raphael adapted quickly, incorporating Michelangelo's muscular figures and dramatic compositions into his own work. A respectful move, also slightly competitive, Michelangelo noticed. He did not applaud. Meanwhile, the original project, the tomb of Pope Julius II, returned like an unresolved argument. What had once been planned as a grand monument, filled with dozens of statues, had been delayed, reduced, redesigned, and generally mishandled for years. Michelangelo was furious. He had poured ambition into that tomb, only to watch it shrink under shifting budgets and priorities. What remained was a shadow of the original vision, but even a reduced Michelangelo project is still Michelangelo. From this frustration came one of his most powerful sculptures, Moses. Carved with intense precision, Moses sits, not relaxed, but contained, muscles tense, gaze sharp, as if he's moments away from standing up and addressing a problem personally. According to legend, Michelangelo was so struck by its realism that he tapped the statue's knee and commanded it to speak. It did not, but the expectation says everything. Despite the compromises, Michelangelo continued to work on the tomb intermittently for decades. It became less of a project and more of a lifelong irritation, a reminder that even genius answers to politics, money, and inconvenient reality. At the same time, his reputation only grew. Florence called him back again. Rome refused to let him go for long. Patrons competed for his attention. Commissions piled up, and expectations became increasingly unreasonable. Michelangelo, unsurprisingly, became more difficult. He argued with clients, ignored advice, worked obsessively, often in isolation. Fame did not soften him, it sharpened him further. Because recognition for Michelangelo wasn't a reward, it was pressure. And just when it seemed like he had already done everything, sculpture, painting, perfection under impossible conditions, Rome had another idea, another wall, another project. And this time the subject wasn't creation, it was the end of everything. Time, that quiet enemy of all artists, eventually caught up with Michelangelo Buonarroti, not gently, not kindly. But then again, Michelangelo was never particularly interested in gentle or kind. By the time he was called back to the Sistine Chapel in the 1530s, he was no longer the defiant young sculptor eager to prove himself. He was older, more guarded, and carrying decades of frustration, unfinished projects, and the lingering annoyance of dealing with powerful men who treated genius like a decorative service. The commission came under Pope Paul III. The task: cover the altar wall of the chapel with a depiction of the Last Judgment. Not a peaceful scene, not a comforting one. Michelangelo accepted. At this point, refusal had become less of a habit and more of a strategic inconvenience. What he created between 1536 and 1541 was not the tidy, orderly vision many expected. It was chaos. Bodies rising, falling, twisting. Saints, sinners, angels, all caught in a storm of motion and consequence. At the centre stood Christ, not as a gentle saviour, but as a powerful, almost terrifying figure delivering judgment with undeniable authority. It was overwhelming. It was also controversial. Nudity everywhere. Muscular, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. For some viewers, it was a masterpiece. For others, it was inappropriate, especially in a sacred space. One critic, Biagio da Cesena, openly complained that the fresco belonged in a bathhouse rather than a chapel. Michelangelo responded in the most Michelangelo way possible. He painted Biagio's face onto Minos, a damned figure in hell, complete with donkey ears and a snake biting him in a rather unfortunate place. A professional disagreement handled with remarkable maturity. Despite criticism, the Last Judgment stood. It was not meant to comfort. It was meant to confront, to remind viewers of consequence, fear, and the fragile line between salvation and damnation. By now, Michelangelo's relationship with his work had changed. Youthful ambition had given way to something heavier. Reflection, perhaps. A quiet awareness that time was limited, and that every new project might be the last truly significant one. Yet he kept working, because stopping was not an option. Not for a man who had spent his entire life chasing perfection he never believed he had reached. And as the years moved forward, Michelangelo would take on one final role. Not as a sculptor, not as a painter, but as something even more unexpected. An architect responsible for shaping the very skyline of Rome. In the court of Kublai Khan, a wedding was never just a wedding. It was a negotiation with silk sleeves and ceremonial bows. A carefully staged moment where two families smiled politely while quietly calculating how much power they had just gained or lost. This particular marriage, arranged somewhere between strategy and necessity, was not born out of affection. It was built on something far more reliable, mutual interest. The Mongol Empire, vast and impressive, was also fragile in its own way. Tribes needed loyalty. Generals needed reassurance. Distant rulers needed a reason not to rebel the moment they felt overlooked. A wedding solved many of these problems at once. The bride, chosen with precision, came from a lineage that mattered. Perhaps her family controlled key trade routes. Perhaps they commanded warriors whose loyalty was flexible. Either way, her presence in the court was not decorative. She was a living agreement, wrapped in layers of silk and expectation. She would not arrive alone. With her came gifts, attendance, and, more importantly, political weight. Every movement she made would be observed, every word measured. Because in this world, even a smile could carry meaning. The groom, likely a prince or trusted noble under Kublai Khan's authority, understood the assignment just as clearly. This was not a moment of personal choice. It was duty. By accepting this marriage, he strengthened his position, secured alliances, and quietly acknowledged the authority of the Khan himself. And above them both stood Kublai, not as a sentimental observer, but as the architect of the entire arrangement. He did not arrange marriages for entertainment. He arranged them to maintain balance across an empire that stretched further than most people could imagine. Every union was a calculated move, subtle, controlled and designed to prevent chaos before it had the chance to begin. The court itself prepared accordingly. Messengers travelled, invitations were sent, and the machinery of imperial ceremony began to move. Silk banners were readied, feasts were planned, rituals rehearsed. But beneath all the preparation, there was something else, tension. Because while weddings in the Mongol court brought celebration, they also brought scrutiny. Allies watched carefully, rivals watched even more carefully. And somewhere in the background, there was always the quiet understanding that alliances built through marriage could strengthen an empire, or expose its weaknesses. This was not just the beginning of a union, it was the beginning of a test. The agreement had been made, the court had prepared. Now came the part that rarely appeared in official records. The journey. The bride did not simply arrive, she was escorted. Across the vast lands of the Mongol Empire, distance was not a minor inconvenience. It was a test of endurance. From wind-swept steppes to fortified cities shaped by Chinese influence, the path to the court of Kublai Khan was long, deliberate, and carefully controlled. Her departure from her homeland was not quiet. It carried ceremony, weight, and a sense of finality that no amount of silk could soften. Families gathered. Elders offered blessings that sounded reassuring, but carried an undertone of resignation. This was not a visit. This was a transfer of identity. Once she left, she would belong to another world. Her escort reflected her importance. Guards, attendants, advisors, each one selected not just for protection but for symbolism. The size of the procession alone sent a message. This was not a minor alliance. This mattered. Caravans moved slowly, deliberately. Horses shifted beneath embroidered saddles. Banners caught the wind, displaying the identity of her lineage. At every stop, local officials observed, greeted, and reported. News travelled ahead of her like a shadow, informing the court of her progress. Inside the moving camp, life was structured and watchful. The bride was never truly alone. Every gesture, every moment of hesitation, every sign of uncertainty noticed. Not always judged, but always remembered. Because how she carried herself now would define how she was received later. The landscapes changed as she moved closer to the heart of the empire. Open steppe gave way to settlements influenced by the growing power of the Yuan court. Markets became busier, roads more organised, the presence of imperial authority more visible. And with each passing day, the distance between her past and future grew. There was no turning back, not in practice, and certainly not in expectation. By the time she approached the imperial centre, the journey had already begun to reshape her. Not physically, perhaps, but in posture, in awareness, in the quiet understanding that she was no longer just a daughter of her family. She was now a representative of it. Ahead lay the court, structured, powerful, and far less forgiving than the open land she had left behind. And as her procession drew closer, the celebrations prepared for her arrival. Because the moment she entered the court of Kublai Khan, she would no longer be travelling. She would be watched. By the time the bride's procession approached the imperial seat of Kublai Khan, the journey itself had already done half the work. It had stripped away hesitation, replaced familiarity with discipline, and prepared her for the one thing no escort could soften: arrival. This was not a quiet entrance. The capital, whether in the great city of Kanbalik or one of the seasonal courts, was designed to overwhelm. Broad avenues, guarded gates, banners stretched across walls like declarations of power. Everything about it communicated the same message. This was not a place where individuals mattered more than the empire. Her procession slowed as it reached the outer gates. Officials waited, not casually, not with curiosity, with precision. Every rank had its place, every gesture its meaning. Messengers moved ahead to announce her arrival formally, repeating titles, lineage, and purpose, as if reciting a carefully memorized truth. The gates opened, and with that she entered a world where nothing was accidental. Inside, the court unfolded in layers, courtyards filled with movement yet controlled, guards in formation, their presence less about threat and more about order, servants who seemed to glide rather than walk, each aware of their position in a system far larger than themselves. The bride remained composed, not because she felt calm, but because she understood the cost of not appearing so. Her clothing, carefully chosen before departure, now served its final purpose. Silk, embroidery, colours, all signalling her status, her origin, her value. In this court, appearance was not vanity. It was language, and everyone was fluent. She was led through a sequence of formal receptions, each one slightly more significant than the last. Lower-ranking officials acknowledged her first, their bows measured. Then higher figures, their attention sharper, their judgment quieter but heavier. Each step brought her closer to the centre, closer to the moment that mattered. And eventually, she stood before the authority that had arranged it all. Kublai Khan did not need to raise his voice. His presence alone carried weight. This was a man who ruled across cultures, across landscapes, across people who did not always agree, but obeyed. Her role was clear. She bowed, not as a gesture of submission alone, but as recognition of power, of order, of the reality she had just entered. From this moment forward, she was no longer arriving. She was part of the court. And the court, as she would soon learn, had its own rules for celebration. Rules that turned a wedding into something far larger than a union. Arrival in the court of Kublai Khan was not the climax. It was merely the beginning of a carefully structured sequence of rituals, each one designed to transform a political agreement into something that looked, at least on the surface, like harmony. Before any celebration could begin, the union had to be recognized. Not emotionally, formally. The bride was guided through a series of preparations that were less about comfort and more about presentation. Her garments were adjusted to reflect her new status. Colours aligned with court expectations. Fabrics chosen to signal not just wealth, but belonging. Layers were added, not simply for beauty, but for meaning. In this court, clothing was never just clothing. It was hierarchy stitched into silk. Attendants worked around her with quiet efficiency. Hair arranged, ornaments placed with precision, every detail checked and rechecked. Nothing could appear accidental. Nothing could suggest uncertainty, because uncertainty here was dangerous. Meanwhile, the groom underwent his own set of formalities. His role, though seemingly more stable, was no less important. He had to present strength, control, and loyalty, qualities that extended beyond the marriage itself and into his relationship with the Khan. This was not a private union. It was a public statement. Between these preparations, ceremonial steps unfolded. Meetings with key figures of the court, each one reinforcing the legitimacy of the match. Elders, officials, advisors, their presence acted as witnesses, not just to the marriage, but to the alliance it represented. Every bow, every exchanged word, every measured silence added another layer of acknowledgement. Outside, the court began to shift. Servants moved with increased urgency. Kitchens prepared for feasts that would stretch across hours, perhaps days. Musicians tuned instruments, their sounds drifting faintly through the structured calm of the palace. Guards adjusted positions, ensuring that celebration would not compromise order, because even in festivity, control remained absolute. The bride, now fully prepared, was no longer just a participant. She was a symbol, refined and presented to fit seamlessly into the machinery of empire. Her earlier journey, her past identity, those were now distant, almost irrelevant. What mattered was this moment. And yet, beneath the layers of silk and ceremony, something quieter remained. Awareness, the understanding that this was not the end of a process, but the beginning of something far more complex. Because the rituals were not about emotion. They were about certainty. Certainty that the alliance would hold. Certainty that the court would accept it. Certainty that the empire, for now, remained balanced. And once that certainty was established, only then could the court allow itself something that resembled celebration, a wedding, or at least something that looked convincingly like one. By the time the ceremony began, nothing about it was uncertain anymore. In the court of Kublai Khan, uncertainty had already been removed, carefully, deliberately, and with the kind of precision that left very little room for improvisation. This was not a spontaneous moment. It was a performance. The bride and groom were led into the ceremonial space, arranged not for comfort, but for visibility. Every position had been decided in advance. Where they stood, how they faced one another, even the timing of their movements, all of it structured to convey a single message. This union was legitimate, recognized, and sanctioned by the highest authority in the empire. Observers gathered, not as guests in the modern sense, but as witnesses. Nobles, military leaders, advisors, each one present not simply to celebrate, but to acknowledge. Their attendance turned a private agreement into a public reality. Silence settled. Then the rituals began. Offerings were presented, symbols of prosperity, loyalty, and continuity. Cups raised, exchanged, sometimes shared, not casually but with meaning attached to every gesture. In many traditions across the Mongol world, the act of sharing drink or food sealed bonds more effectively than spoken promises. Words could be forgotten. Actions less so. The bride's role was measured, deliberate. She followed the sequence expected of her, each step reinforcing her place within this new structure. The groom mirrored her in his own way, projecting stability, control, and the quiet assurance that he understood exactly what this moment required. Above it all, Kublai Khan observed. He did not need to intervene. His presence alone confirmed the legitimacy of everything unfolding below. The ceremony was not just happening under his rule, it was happening because of it. As the final ritual concluded, the shift was subtle, but unmistakable. They were no longer separate figures brought together by arrangement. They were now recognized as one unit within the court. And just like that, the purpose of the ceremony had been fulfilled. No grand declarations of love, no emotional display, just structure, acknowledgement, and completion. Yet, despite the controlled nature of the event, something had changed. Not visibly, perhaps, but within the court itself. A new connection had been established. A new balance formed. The alliance was no longer theoretical. It was real. And now that it had been confirmed, the court could finally allow itself to move beyond structure, towards something less rigid, towards something louder. Because if the ceremony was about power, the celebration was about displaying it. Once the ceremony had done its quiet, efficient work, the court of Kublai Khan allowed itself something far less restrained. Celebration. But even here, nothing was truly spontaneous. The feasting halls came alive in carefully orchestrated motion. Long tables stretched across the space, layered with foods meant not just to satisfy hunger, but to impress. Roasted meats, horse, lamb, game, arranged in abundance. Bowls of fermented mare's milk, kumis passed from hand to hand. Imported delicacies from across the empire. Spices, grains, fruits, each one quietly announcing the reach of Mongol power. This was not dinner. This was geography, served on a plate. The bride and groom sat in positions that made them visible to all, elevated just enough to be observed, but not so distant as to feel removed. They were part of the display now, central figures in a carefully staged moment of unity. Around them, nobles and commanders gathered, their presence forming a map of alliances. Who sat where mattered, who spoke to whom mattered even more. Conversations flowed, but beneath them ran a quieter current. Calculation, observation, subtle reaffirmations of loyalty. Music began. Traditional instruments filled the space with steady rhythmic sound. Drums, strings, voices rising in patterns that carried across the hall. Performers moved with practiced precision. Dancers stepping in time, their movements echoing stories of conquest, migration, and survival. This was not entertainment in the modern sense. It was memory performed. At intervals, toasts were made, cups raised toward the Khan, toward the couple, toward the empire itself. Each toast carried weight, reinforcing bonds that extended beyond the moment. To refuse or even hesitate would not go unnoticed. So no one hesitated. Laughter followed, though never uncontrolled. Even joy here had structure. Even celebration had boundaries. The bride observed all of this carefully. Every gesture, every interaction. She was no longer simply present. She was being integrated, expected to understand, to adapt, to belong within this system where power was displayed openly, but never carelessly. The groom, more familiar with the environment, played his role with confidence. He spoke, acknowledged, responded, a bridge between the bride's past and the court's expectations. And above it all, Kublai Khan watched, not judging, observing. Because a feast like this was not just about celebration, it was a test of behaviour, of loyalty, of how well each piece of this newly formed alliance fit into the larger structure. And as the night stretched on, filled with sound, movement, and carefully managed excess, one thing became clear. The marriage had been sealed. Now it had to survive. By now the hall was louder, warmer, looser. At least that's how it appeared on the surface. Cups had been raised enough times to blur the edge between formality and something resembling ease. Laughter echoed more freely, but in the court of Kublai Khan, nothing was ever just laughter. Beneath the music and feasting, another kind of ceremony unfolded. Quieter, sharper, and far more important in the long run. Conversations. The bride and groom, seated at the centre of attention, were no longer simply being observed. They were now participants in the subtle exchange of power. Nobles approached one by one, offering congratulations that carried layers of meaning beneath their polite tone. A bow might signal respect, a longer conversation might signal interest. A carefully chosen gift might signal expectation. Each interaction was a message, and every message needed to be understood. The bride, now more composed than when she first arrived, began to respond with measured confidence. She listened more than she spoke. A wise choice, observing who held influence, who deferred, who avoided eye contact. In a court like this, silence often revealed more than words. The groom, meanwhile, moved with familiarity. He greeted allies, acknowledged rivals, and reinforced his position within the shifting structure of the court. This was his environment, but even he was not immune to scrutiny, because alliances once formed required maintenance. At the edges of the hall, smaller groups gathered, conversations less formal but no less important. Military leaders discussed campaigns in quiet tones. Advisors weighed implications of the new union. Even distant envoys watched closely, measuring what this marriage might mean for regions far beyond the court. The empire did not pause for celebration. It adapted through it. At times glances were exchanged, quick, subtle, almost invisible. A nod here, a pause there. Agreements forming without ever being spoken aloud. This was diplomacy at its most refined. quiet, controlled, and deniable if necessary. And throughout it all, Kublai Khan remained present, not intervening, not directing, just watching. He understood that power did not come from forcing outcomes, but from shaping conditions where outcomes became inevitable. This wedding had already strengthened certain ties. Now it was revealing new possibilities and potential fractures, because every alliance creates new balances, and every balance carries risk. As the celebration continued, the bride and groom were no longer just symbols of unity. They were now part of a living system of influence, expectation, and quiet negotiation. The laughter still filled the hall, but beneath it, the real work had already begun. By the time the last echoes of music faded, and the great halls of the court fell quiet, the celebration had already done its work. What remained was something far less visible, and far more important: mourning. In the court of Kublai Khan, the morning after a wedding was not a gentle return to routine. It was a transition, the moment when symbolism hardened into expectation. The bride awoke not as a guest, not as a visitor, but as part of the court itself. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but absolute. The attendants who entered her chamber no longer treated her as someone passing through. Their gestures carried a new weight, measured respect, quiet observation. She was no longer being introduced, she was being assessed. Her movements that morning mattered. How she greeted those around her, how quickly she adapted to the rhythms of the court. Even small choices, when to speak, when to remain silent, began shaping her position within a system that noticed everything. The groom faced his own transition. The ceremony had confirmed his role. The celebration had displayed it. Now came the responsibility of maintaining it. He was expected to act not just as a husband, but as a stabilizing figure. Someone who could carry the alliance forward without disrupting the balance that had just been carefully constructed. Because alliances once formed do not sustain themselves. They require attention. Across the court, the effects of the marriage were already unfolding. Messengers prepared to carry news outward, across steppe, cities, and distant territories. Reports would describe the ceremony, the presence of key figures, the tone of the celebration. Every detail mattered. In distant regions, leaders would interpret these messages, adjusting their own positions accordingly. Some would feel reassured, others perhaps would grow cautious, because a new alliance often meant a shift in power, and shifts in power rarely went unnoticed. Within the court, interactions changed. Figures who had watched quietly the night before now began to engage more directly. Conversations resumed, but with a new context. The bride was no longer a subject of discussion. She was part of the structure being discussed. And above it all, Kublai Khan observed once more. Not celebrating, not reflecting, evaluating. The wedding had achieved its immediate purpose. The alliance had been formed, displayed, and acknowledged. Now came the longer task, ensuring that it held. Because in an empire as vast as his, stability was never permanent. It was maintained. And as the court settled into its new arrangement, one thing became clear. The wedding was over, but its consequences had only just begun. The celebration had faded. The rituals were complete. The court of Kublai Khan had already moved on to its next concern, as it always did. Empires, unlike weddings, do not pause to reflect. And yet this marriage lingered, not in poetry, not in quiet memories, but in decisions, movements, and the slow reshaping of power across lands that would never see the ceremony, yet would feel its effects. The bride, once defined by her departure, now existed fully within the court. Her presence became routine, familiar to some, strategically important to others. Over time, she learned the rhythms of influence, when to speak, when to remain silent, when to act through others rather than directly. Because in a court like this, visibility was not always power. Sometimes, survival depended on knowing when not to be seen. The groom, too, carried the weight of the union forward. His actions were no longer his alone. Every decision reflected not just his loyalty to the Khan, but the strength of the alliance his marriage represented. Success would reinforce it. Failure could quietly unravel it. This was the reality beneath the ceremony. No vows, no promises, just expectation. Beyond the court, the consequences spread outward. Families tied to the bride gained influence, or at least protection. Rivals adjusted their positions, careful not to challenge a connection now backed by imperial authority. Trade routes, military loyalties, even minor disputes, each one subtly influenced by the existence of this union, not dramatically, but persistently. This was how power moved in the Mongol world, not always through conquest, but through connection, through marriages that stitched together territories, not with borders, but with obligation. And above it all, Kublai Khan's design held, for now, he had not created a moment. He had created a structure, a union that could stabilize a region, delay conflict, or quietly strengthen his reach without raising a single blade. To him, the wedding was never the goal. It was the method. Over time, new marriages would be arranged, new alliances formed. The court would shift again, as it always did. Faces would change. Loyalties would be tested. But this union, this carefully constructed bond, would remain part of that evolving system, not remembered as a romantic story, not recorded as a grand event, but embedded in the machinery of empire. Because in the world of Kublai Khan, a wedding was never just a beginning. It was a decision, one that would outlive the celebration, outlast the participants, and quietly shape the future long after the music had stopped. And that, more than anything else, was its true purpose. A pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela Cathedral did not begin with a step. It began with a decision that most people would quietly regret about 3 days later. In medieval Europe, the idea of walking across entire countries, through forests, mountains, mud, and the occasional suspicious village, was not considered leisure. It was considered necessary. Necessary for faith, for forgiveness, or for reasons people preferred not to explain in detail. At the centre of it all was the shrine of St. James the Greater. According to belief, his remains rested in Santiago, far in the west of the Iberian Peninsula, a place that, for many pilgrims, might as well have been the edge of the known world. Reaching it meant something. What exactly it meant depended on who you asked. Some believed the journey could erase sins, not reduce them, not negotiate them, erase them. A bold claim, and one that made the long walk suddenly seem worth considering. Others were sent. A lord might assign a pilgrimage as penance. A court might demand it as punishment. Walk to Santiago, they would say, and perhaps God will forgive you. Or at least, we won't have to deal with you for a while. And then there were those who simply left. Farmers tired of repetition. Merchants seeking more than profit. People who needed distance. From grief, from mistakes, from lives that no longer made sense. The road offered something rare in the medieval world. Movement. Change, a chance, however uncertain, to become someone slightly different by the time you arrived. Preparation was simple, almost suspiciously so. A cloak, a staff, a small bag, perhaps a shell, the symbol of the pilgrimage, pinned to clothing or carried as proof of intention. No luxury, no excess. The road did not reward comfort. And once the decision was made, there was no graceful way to undo it. The first step was easy, the second less so. By the third, the weight of the journey began to settle, not just on the body, but on the mind, because a pilgrimage was not just distance. It was time. Time to think, time to doubt, time to question why you had chosen this path in the first place. And yet they kept walking, because turning back meant returning unchanged. And for most pilgrims, that was the one outcome they could not accept. The beginning of a pilgrimage has a certain charm to it. The road feels manageable. The body, still fresh, cooperates. Even the idea of walking for weeks, perhaps months, seems almost reasonable. This is, of course, a lie. As pilgrims left their homes and joined the winding paths that would eventually lead towards Santiago de Compostela Cathedral, the first days carried a quiet sense of optimism. Villages were still familiar. Roads, though uneven, were not yet hostile. Fellow travellers appeared now and then, some alone, some in small groups, each moving west with their own reasons, their own silence. At first, there was conversation. Where are you from? Why are you walking? How far do you plan to go? Simple questions, exchanged between strangers who understood that, for a time, their paths would overlap. These early connections felt almost light, temporary, no one yet burdened by the full weight of the journey. But the road had a way of correcting expectations. Blisters came first. Quiet at the beginning, then increasingly insistent. Boots that seemed fine at departure began to betray their owners. Shoulders ached under even the smallest load. Sleep became less about comfort and more about necessity, wherever it could be found. And then there was the distance. Maps, when they existed, were vague. Distances were measured less in miles and more in days. 3 days to the next town, someone might say, with a confidence that felt optimistic at best. The horizon, always just out of reach, offered no clear answers. Weather added its own complications. Rain turned roads into mud. Sun drained energy without mercy. Wind, especially across open land, wore down even the most determined traveller. There was no shelter on demand. No easy escape from the elements. The road was not interested in convenience. Yet, as the initial discomfort set in, something else began to emerge. Rhythm. Steps found a pattern. Breathing adjusted. The mind, once filled with noise, plans, doubts, second thoughts, began to quiet. Conversation faded, not out of hostility, but because it became unnecessary. Walking side by side in silence felt enough. Strangers became companions, not through shared stories, but through shared endurance. And slowly, the journey stopped feeling like a decision that needed justification. It became something simpler, a direction. West, toward a place most had never seen, but believed in anyway. And as the first miles gave way to many more, one thing became clear. The road was not going to get easier, but the pilgrims, in their own quiet way, were already beginning to change. As the first illusions of ease faded, the pilgrims found themselves absorbed into something older than any single journey, the network of routes that would later be known as the Camino de Santiago. These were not newly built roads, designed for comfort or efficiency. They were inherited paths, Roman roads cracked by time, trade routes shaped by merchants, rural tracks carved by generations who had walked them long before pilgrimage gave them meaning. Now they carried something else, intention, and intention leaves marks. Pilgrims began to notice signs. Not official ones, those would come much later, but subtle indicators left by those who had passed before. A worn stone here, a carved symbol there, sometimes a simple shell marking a direction westward, pointing towards Santiago de Compostela Cathedral, as if the land itself had learned to guide them. The journey became less solitary. Along the road, small communities had grown to accommodate this steady flow of travellers. Monasteries offered shelter, sometimes freely, sometimes in exchange for prayer or labour. Hospices, simple, crowded and often uncomfortable, provided a place to rest. Bread, broth, and a place on the floor could feel like a luxury after a long day of walking. Not all help was given kindly. Some saw pilgrims as opportunity. Prices rose in certain towns. Food was stretched thinner. Trust became something to be measured carefully, because while the road was shared, not everyone walking beside you had the same intentions. And yet, despite these risks, a quiet structure held. Pilgrims began to move in loose patterns, leaving at dawn, resting at midday, pushing forward until light faded. They learned which stops were safe, which routes were shorter, which streams could be trusted. Information passed between them without ceremony, built on experience rather than authority. There was no central control, only memory. The landscape itself shifted as they moved west. Rolling plains opened into wide stretches where the sky seemed too large. Forests closed in, their silence deeper than the conversations left behind. Rivers marked transitions, physical boundaries that reminded travellers how far they had come and how much remained. Each step added to something larger, not just distance but accumulation, of fatigue, of thought, of presence. And somewhere along these ancient roads the journey began to change shape again. It was no longer just about reaching a destination. It was about enduring the path. Because the road to Santiago was not designed to be conquered. It was meant to be walked, slowly, painfully, and with a kind of patience that only time could teach. And the further west they moved, the more the outside world seemed to fade, leaving behind only the road and themselves. By the time the road had settled into routine, it had already begun to test its travellers in ways no one fully anticipated. Pilgrimage, despite its spiritual framing, was not an abstract experience. It was physical, uncomfortably so. And as the miles stretched on, the body started asking questions the mind had not prepared answers for. Food became the first concern. pilgrims did not travel with abundance. Supplies were limited, carried in small bags that grew lighter with each passing day. Bread hardened quickly. Meat, when available, rarely lasted long. Water sources varied, some clear, some questionable, all necessary. Hunger was not constant, but it was familiar, a quiet companion that followed without complaint. Those who had expected divine comfort found instead practical reality. Weather followed closely behind. The road offered no protection. Rain turned paths into thick, stubborn mud that clung to boots and slowed every step. Sun drained strength steadily, leaving travellers weak before they realised it. Wind, especially across open land, wore down even the strongest among them, not with force but with persistence. There was no negotiation with the elements, only adaptation. Clothing became more than fabric. Cloaks, once just part of preparation, turned into shields against cold mornings and damp nights. A simple hat could mean the difference between endurance and exhaustion. Pilgrims adjusted constantly, learning not from instruction, but from consequence. And then there was the body itself. Blisters deepened, muscles stiffened. Sleep, when it came, was often interrupted. By discomfort, by noise, by the simple difficulty of finding a place to rest among others equally worn down. There was no perfect recovery, only enough to continue. Yet something strange happened within this hardship. Complaints faded, not because the suffering disappeared, but because it became expected, shared. There was little value in describing pain when everyone around you understood it without explanation. Silence grew. Not empty silence, but a kind that held weight. Pilgrims walked side by side without speaking. Their presence enough. Occasional words were exchanged, practical, necessary, but conversation itself became less important than movement, step after step. The road, indifferent as ever, did not reward effort. It did not ease for those who struggled. It simply continued, stretching westward toward Santiago de Compostela Cathedral, offering no guarantee beyond the fact that it existed. And so the pilgrims adapted. They walked when they could, rested when they had to, endured because there was no alternative that made sense. Because by now, turning back was no longer just a physical choice. It was a failure of something deeper. And so they continued, hungry, tired, and quieter than before, moving not with certainty, but with persistence. By now the road had done its quiet work. It had stripped away comfort, tested patience, and reduced life to something simple. Walk, rest, continue. But it had also done something less expected. It had brought people together. Pilgrims who began alone rarely remained that way for long. The routes towards Santiago de Compostela Cathedral were filled with travellers moving at similar pace, sharing the same burdens, the same uncertainties. Over time, distances between strangers narrowed, not physically at first, but gradually through shared experience. A group would form without announcement. Someone walking beside you one day would still be there the next, then the next. No agreement made, no promises exchanged. Just a quiet understanding that continuing together made the journey manageable. There was comfort in that. Conversations returned, but they had changed. No longer the light exchanges of the early days. Now they carried weight. Stories shared not to pass time, but to explain presence. Why they had left. What they hoped to find. What they feared they might not. Some spoke openly. Others did not. Silence, even within a group, was accepted. Expected even. There was no pressure to fill it. Walking side by side, hearing only footsteps and breath, felt natural, almost necessary. Each pilgrim carried something different. A former soldier who walked with a limp, saying little about how he had earned it. A merchant who once cared only for profit, now unsure what he was seeking. A young woman sent by her family, her purpose clear, but her thoughts her own. Their paths had been separate. Now, for a time, they overlapped. Roles emerged quietly. Someone knew which towns offered safe shelter. Another could read the land, guiding the group when paths split. One might share food more freely, another can serve carefully. These differences did not divide them, they balanced them. Trust formed slowly. Not through declarations, but through consistency. Walking the same road, facing the same hardships, returning each morning, still moving in the same direction, west. Yet even within this fragile community, there was an understanding. This was temporary. The road brought people together, but it also carried them forward. Some would fall behind. Others would move ahead. Illness, injury, or simple difference in pace would eventually separate them. No one said it out loud. They didn't need to, because the pilgrimage was never about staying together. It was about moving forward. And for now, moving forward together made the silence feel less empty, even if it would not last. By now, the road had become familiar, predictable in its discomfort, reliable in its demands. But familiarity did not mean safety. Far from it. The routes leading west towards Santiago de Compostela Cathedral passed through lands that were not always kind to those who travelled without protection. Pilgrims, by their very nature, carried little and appeared vulnerable. To some, this made them uninteresting. To others, it made them ideal. Bandits were a quiet presence along certain stretches of the road. Not constant, not everywhere, but known. Stories travelled faster than the pilgrims themselves. Tales of theft, of travellers disappearing, of encounters that ended poorly. Whether exaggerated or not, they shaped behaviour. Groups tightened. Where once companions walked for comfort, they now stayed together for protection. Camps were chosen more carefully. Fires were kept small. Trust, already measured, became even more deliberate. And yet danger was not always external. Illness moved silently through the road. A cough that lingered. A fever that rose without warning. Injuries, small at first, grew worse with every step. There were no physicians waiting at every turn. No guaranteed care. A pilgrim could begin the day with strength and end it unable to continue. When that happened, the road did not stop. This was perhaps the hardest truth. Those who could no longer walk were sometimes left behind, placed in the care of a monastery if one was nearby, or simply given what help could be offered before the group moved on, not out of cruelty but necessity. The journey demanded movement. Standing still too long meant risking everything. It forced a kind of acceptance that was rarely spoken aloud. Not everyone would reach the end. Doubt followed closely behind. It arrived quietly, usually in moments of stillness. At night, when the body ached and sleep refused to come easily. In long stretches of road where the landscape offered nothing but repetition. Questions surfaced. Why am I doing this? Will it change anything? Is there even a point? Faith, once clear at the beginning, became something more complicated, less certain, more tested. Some held onto it tightly, using it as an anchor. Others found it slipping, replaced by something quieter, resignation perhaps, or endurance without explanation. And yet, despite all of it, they kept walking, because by now, the journey was no longer just about reaching a destination. It had become something else, a measure of will, of belief, of how far a person could go when turning back felt worse than continuing. The road did not offer answers, only distance, and so they moved forward. Through danger, through doubt, through the quiet understanding that the pilgrimage was asking more of them than they had expected. And it was not finished yet. After weeks, sometimes months of walking, something began to change. Not in the body. That remained tired, predictable in its complaints. But in the road itself, in the small details that, at first, might have gone unnoticed. Now they stood out. The pilgrims moving west towards Santiago de Compostela Cathedral began to see more signs. Not official markers. Those belonged to a much later world. But symbols left by those who had come before. Carved shells on stone. Worn paths that split less often. Villages that seemed to expect them. The scallop shell in particular appeared more frequently. Simple. Recognizable. A quiet reassurance that the direction remained true. It was not just a symbol of the pilgrimage. It was proof that others had walked this way, had endured the same distance, and had reached something at the end of it. That mattered. The land itself shifted as well. The long, open stretches gave way to terrain that felt more deliberate. Forests closing in, hills rising gently, paths narrowing as if guiding travellers toward a point they could not yet see, but were beginning to feel. There was a sense of nearness. Not precise, not measurable, but present. The groups of pilgrims changed too. Some who had walked together for weeks were no longer there, lost to illness, slowed by injury, or simply separated by pace. New faces appeared, those who had joined the road later, fresher, less worn, but carrying the same intention. There was less conversation now, not because there was nothing to say, but because most of what needed to be said had already been understood. The shared experience had done its work. Words became unnecessary. Even the doubts had shifted. They did not disappear, but they softened, replaced in part by something quieter. Anticipation, perhaps, or the cautious belief that the journey might actually end. And with that belief came reflection. The reasons that had started the pilgrimage, faith, guilt, escape, no longer felt as sharp as they once had. The road had worn them down, reshaped them. What remained was less defined, but more real. The pilgrims were no longer the same people who had begun this journey. Not entirely, and as they continued west, the presence of the destination grew stronger. Not visible, not yet, but undeniable. The road was narrowing. The distance was shrinking. And soon, after all the silence, the endurance, the quiet suffering, they would arrive, not as they had left, but as something the road had made of them. The first sign of arrival was not the city itself. It was the change in movement. Pilgrims who had spent weeks walking in quiet rhythm began to slow, not from exhaustion, but from something else. Awareness. The sense that the journey once endless now had a boundary, that somewhere ahead, beyond the final rise or turn, stood Santiago de Compostela Cathedral. And then, eventually, it appeared. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Towers rising above the clustered buildings, visible long before the details could be made out. For many, that first glimpse was enough. Some stopped walking altogether, as if unsure what to do with the fact that the road had actually led somewhere. Others continued forward, slower now, each step carrying weight. The city received them without ceremony. There was no grand welcome waiting at the gates, no moment designed for emotional release. Santiago was a functioning place, busy, structured, filled with people who had seen pilgrims arrive countless times before. To the city, this was routine. To the pilgrims, it was not. They entered through narrow streets, worn by years of movement. The sounds changed. Footsteps echoing against stone, voices blending into something less isolated than the road. The silence that had defined the journey began to dissolve, replaced by the presence of others who had reached the same point. And then the cathedral, larger up close than memory could prepare for, its structure dominating the space around it, stone layered over centuries, built not just as a place of worship, but as a destination, an end to something that had required more than most journeys ever asked. Inside, the air felt different, still. Heavy! Not with noise, but with accumulation, of prayers, of expectation, of countless arrivals that had come before. Pilgrims moved through the space carefully, not directed, but guided by something quieter. Some knelt, some stood, some simply looked, as if trying to understand what exactly they had reached. The tomb of St. James the Greater lay at the centre of it all. For many, this was the purpose, the reason that had justified every step, every moment of doubt, every hardship endured along the way. And yet, standing there, the feeling was not always what they had imagined. There was no clear answer waiting, no sudden transformation, just presence. The journey, once defined by distance, had ended, but what it had changed, what it had meant, was something each pilgrim had to face alone. Because arrival, as it turned out, was not the conclusion. It was the moment where the road stopped, and understanding had to begin. The journey had ended, or at least that was the expectation. After weeks, sometimes months of walking, the pilgrims stood within Santiago de Compostela Cathedral, having reached the place that had defined every step behind them. The road, with all its silence and suffering, no longer stretched forward, and yet something remained unfinished. The rituals that followed arrival were simple, almost understated. Pilgrims attended Mass, offered prayers, and, when possible, received proof of completion. A recognition that they had walked the distance, endured the road, and reached the shrine of St. James the Greater. It was official, they had arrived. But arrival did not answer the questions that had formed along the way. For some there was relief, a quiet release of tension that had built over time. The body, no longer required to move, began to recover. The mind, freed from constant focus on the next step, had space to settle. For others the feeling was less clear. The purpose that had driven them forward, the need to reach this place, was now gone. In its absence, something unexpected appeared. Uncertainty. What now? What does this mean? Was the journey enough? Or had it only revealed something incomplete? Because the pilgrimage, despite all its structure, had never guaranteed clarity. It had only created the conditions for it. Some pilgrims chose to stay for a time, lingering in the city as if hoping understanding might arrive with rest. Others turned back quickly, eager to return to the lives they had left behind, though often unsure if those lives would still feel the same, and many found that they did not. The road had changed them, not in a dramatic, visible way, but in something quieter, in patience, in awareness, in the understanding that movement itself, step after step without certainty, had meaning. Returning home did not erase that. It carried it forward. The pilgrimage, then, was not a closed journey. It did not begin at departure and end at arrival. It extended beyond both, into the lives the pilgrims resumed, into the choices they made afterward, into the way they understood time, effort, and belief. The road to Santiago ended in stone, but the experience of walking it did not end there, because once you have crossed that distance, once you have faced the silence, the doubt, the persistence required to continue, you do not simply return to who you were before. You carry the road with you, quietly, unnoticed by most, but always present,